This is the second of our discussion series for the project Pushing the Boundaries, which is funded by the John Templeton Foundation and is hosted and located at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, co-led by Tarja Knutila and me. And this is part of our outreach series where we invite a bunch of interesting people and have a chat with them about concepts that are important for the project, but hopefully also for philosophers and other researchers that happen to tune in at this point. And we're also going to put this as a recording up on YouTube. Um, Today's guest is a special pleasure for me because not only is he an excellent philosopher, but also a good friend. Dan Brooks is the world's leading expert, I think that's fair to say, on the concept of levels of organization, which is what we're going to talk about today. Don't make that face, Dan. Um, I met Dan at the Konrad Lorenz Institute when he was a fellow there, and I was the director. I didn't choose Dan as a fellow because that was before I was there, but it turned to be such a good start. We had such an amazing time. And if I publish in philosophical journals right now, so this is to a large part also the fault of Dan making me read stuff and actually learn really good stuff about philosophy. So I am really in Dan's step. Um, but the reason we have Dan here is not that, but that he has done some really interesting work about this concept of levels of organization, which is one of the toughest concepts to get a grip on, I think, in science. But it's also pervasive and it's really important in various sciences. And Dan, over the years now, has been doing absolutely amazing work on levels. Check out his papers. And also, we're looking forward and we hope that there will be a book about levels that you've been writing on for a while. That should be coming up. When? Do you have a schedule yet? No.
Now
But
two books.
two books. Great. Two books about levels. What is already published is a collected uh, a volume of essays together with James D. Frisco and Bill Wimsatt about levels of organization in the MIT press. What's it called again? I was an editor there. I should remember.
Levels of
Uh,
organization in the biological sciences.
yeah. Okay. So thanks, Dan. And with that, I'll just hand over to you and let you introduce the topic for today.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll give a bit of a personal tour through the things that have sort of motivated me over the years to continue my studies into this concept, levels of organization. Um, as you said in your introduction, it is an extremely slippery concept to kind of maintain a grasp upon because it is so ubiquitous throughout many of the natural sciences. There are so many uses that people sort of expect of the concept. And it is just a mainstay sort of notion that we, just very effortlessly grab onto and apply for philosophical and also scientific purposes. Um, and so the first thing I want to start out with is to sort of hammer home the point that this is about the size of the concept. This is a very, very large concept. And what I mean, sort of metaphorically, by the size of the concept is that virtually every aspect of the concept is uh, uh, up for debate or up for discussion about what it means, what levels are, how is it used and stuff like that. And that's exactly the sort of tour I want to give to you, is to sort of introduce the major organizing sort of folders that I keep my levels thoughts in. And these have to do with sort of core questions about how can we start to gain a grasp, and then once we have a little bit of a grasp, maintain that grasp on the levels concept moving forward into the more sort of in the trenches uses and roles that it exhibits in different philosophical and scientific debates. So to put them all out on the table, these different folders have to do with the nature of levels, the character of levels, the significance of levels, and the history of levels. And each one of these things sort of premises the my approach to levels by sort of estimating it as a scientific concept, not by taking it for granted as something that is posited out there, but rather to say this is a scientific concept that is actively used and adapted to many different uses in the sciences. It exhibits, for that reason alone, philosophical significance. But I would argue, maybe we can get to that later on, that it's kind of taken on a life of its own within philosophy itself, as being inspired by the scientific uses of the concept. So to go through these sort of folders of thinking, the nature question is has to do with what does this concept purport to sort of track in nature? You know, if we can come up with a putative sort of characterization of levels of organization, uh, you know, what are these things in nature? This is a question that I have for most of my career put to the back of the line because it has to do with a lot of metaphysics and a lot of ontology and a lot of sort of questions about the realism of the concept. And so, for that reason, out of respect for these types of issues and fields, I've taken more of a cautious approach to coming up with an ontological answer because it just seems to me that ontological answers have this sense of finality to them. And one of the things that I've seen in especially the history of the levels concept is its sort of propensity to be revised over time, even by individual users. And so we can circle back onto that because it was actually Bill Wimsatt's description of local maxima that maybe you've run into. I'm pretty sure this will come up in the questions that began my interest in levels, and that's a very sort of ontologically laden characterization. But like I said, I pushed that off to the side. Where I really got my start was talking about the significance and the character of the levels concept. And the significance question is what is its purported usefulness? For this, I take a kind of heuristic approach with a strong caveat attached to that I am not a fan of knee-jerk reactions that sort of denigrate the notion of heuristic, where you often encounter in the literature that something is merely heuristic. That is, it's not really principled, it's not really, interesting, it's not really, going to have long-term effects and stuff like that. I disagree with that. Here, again, I take a Wimsattian view that heuristics encompass usually the best attempts that we have to getting at a sort of issue, concept, or phenomenon, and that these can be iteratively checked across generations, across different users, so that we can revise our characterizations, definitions, and take up the best that we have with those. The character question has to do with how the concept is actually used in the hands of scientists. And this is something that I find that is taken far too quickly for granted, especially in philosophy, because of the widespreadness of the concept in the different sort of branches of science that it's applied. There is vanishingly small hope that we're going to find, one characterization of levels or one characterization of the use of levels that will substantively sort of inform what we, kind of expect the concept to tell us once we have a grasp on it. Now, this is one thing that I'm actively working on at the moment. And one of the key findings that I found is that if you look at the way that levels are used across different branches of science, let's say like ecology or neuroscience or cell biology, you have interesting and sort of persistent differences in the patterns of usage that that scientists sort of apply the levels concept with in looking at how they basically conceive of the notion, in what roles it's supposed to be doing, what methodologies they take to be sort of buttressed by referring to levels and stuff like that. That's very interesting. I have a manuscript currently under review right now where we tackle this question in neuroscience, because it gets to a larger question that sort of underscores the importance of getting to this character question: how is it used in science? And that is that there are so many different ways that people expect the naked notion of levels without qualifier to sort of pan out into a unitary discourse. So in just remaining with neuroscience, for instance, you have the sort of tradition of levels of analysis that David Marr and his colleagues have sort of elevated in cognitive neuroscience. That I would argue at some point or at any point really that this is a very distinct notion of the idea of levels of organization as it's used in the sort of biological sciences. But there are also other different ways of talking about levels. So one sort of meta criterion that we have to sort of I would wish that people could agree to talk about more is what notion or what object are we even trying to talk about when we talk about levels? I put my 2 cents behind the notion of levels of organization, but other people would say, for instance, well, levels is just this kind of universal word, to use the words of Mario Bunke, that can be sort of defined in so many different ways that we have to resort to sort of like extremely formalistic work to sort of capture the notion and all of its domains of application. And I think I'm going a bit over time, but I mean, the history in and of itself is an interesting thing. And this is something I've talked about actually with Hazak when I was in Cambridge a couple of times for a research visit. And he convinced me that the story that there is to tell about the history of levels is one that deserves its own book. And so I have kind of diverted a lot of my efforts to doing a more theoretical, philosophical approach, but then also a historical approach. And I will be, I think, a bit coy with that historical part because that would be a talk in and of itself. Let's just say it's interesting. Now, as a kind of conclusion, I just say that this puts a lot of stuff on the table. I haven't, for instance, given any kind of characterization or indication about what I understand levels to be. But I think I can do that during the discussion. I mean, the basic approach is pretty clear to everyone that the world is populated by, these scale relative units that sort of, fill out the different scales of nature and stuff like that. I'll just leave it at that, and we'll get into the specifics later.
Thanks, Dan. There's a ton of things to unpack here. And so the way this works for those who are here the first time and didn't join us last week is we'll open the discussion to the panel now, and Paul, Kevin, and I will ask Dan a bunch of questions until the end of the hour, and then we'll open it to the whole audience so that you can ask your own questions. As I said, if you don't want to show up on screen, keep your camera off and just write your question in the chat. If you want to be seen, switch your camera off on during the plenary discussion and ask your question directly. Just raise your hand in the Zoom. Thanks, Dan. So you steered very elegantly our attention to a bunch of aspects of levels, and you diverted them also very smoothly from others. And we're not going to actually touch in the beginning on the history of the concept, but I do want to ask you a little bit about that later on. But what I wanted to start with is this conception that you started out with. Bill Wimsatt from Re-Engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings has this amazing account in chapter 10 of the book about the ontology of dynamical systems, which is leveled, and this leveled world with also amazing drawings that he illustrates the whole argument with. And in there, as you mentioned already, he has this definition that I'm just going to throw at you to get the discussion started. And we have discussed a lot about this already. I know that, Dan. So let's do a bit of that discussion in public. And Wimsatt's definition is, as you said already, I'm going to read it in full extent. Levels of organization are local maxima of regularity and predictability in the phase space of alternate modes of organization of matter. What does that mean? Can you give us a...
I mean, it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I have to say about Bill is he is a rare type of thinker that you must return to after reading his work, because in the process of metabolizing his work, uh, your understanding of what he's getting at changes, because I would say his ideas are so rich. But the the cost of that is a bit of fuzziness. Let me change that. A lot of fuzziness. So what does it mean to say that levels are local maxima in the phase space of the alternate forms of the organization of matter, or something like that? Just take that definition. So the first thing I would actually push back on, because these little types of meta criteria, end up carrying a lot of weight later on in the discussion, is that in that same paper, Wimsatt does not offer that as a definition. I don't think. In fact, he says a few paragraphs after that. No, I'm sorry. Before that, I think it's page 203. I can't remember, in the 2007 book, that in fact definitions are notoriously unhelpful in contexts like these. And so, before I get to your specific answer to what how we should understand this characterization of levels, I want to give Wimsatt credit in among philosophers of identifying the size of the concept, something that I mentioned in my introduction. What in my discussions with Bill, one of the things that he said is that at the time that he wrote that definition, which I think it first came out in '76, you know, uh, he was looking at how levels are used in the biological sciences, and there were so many characterizations, just a huge scope of ways to sort of conceive of this idea that, by all accounts, was very widespread in the biological sciences at that time. But in philosophy in particular, there was very little work on characterizing what a level actually was. Now, that's not quite true, because you'd have to qualify this with what kind of levels concept was, being ignored, according to my claim, and that conception, or that concept, was levels of organization in particular. He was essentially reacting to the so-called layer cake model that was popularized by Oppenheim and Putnam in 1958, where essentially what you had was this stepwise sort of ladder to nature that sort of made every putative sort of level of organization unilateral across all of nature and all of the sciences, so that we have a univocal notion of a cell, for instance, and we have a corresponding scientific discipline, cell biology, that studies that. And this is essentially how we think about levels of organization. And Wimsatt was reacting to that, and he said, "No, it is way more complex than that, because we have to keep in mind what levels are being used, in what context levels are being used in, and we're using them in context of, like, not only the sort of mechanistic science of genetics and cell biology, but also evolution and ecology, and essentially all the life sciences that have anything to do with biology." And so, what if we sort of look at all of that together? What is this concept sort of getting at? And so, finally, to get to a specific answer to your question, the thing that I would start sort of pecking out of his characterization and sort of laying it on the table is to say that he identifies the domain of application of the concept as the organization of matter, right? Organization being a second notorious notion that's very difficult to get a grasp on. But there is this sort of notion that organization of matter has very much, if not existentially much, to do with the sort of identity of what you're talking about in the first place. So if we
Right.
talk about
So just to clarify, so this is divorcing it a bit from, for example, levels of explanation, which is a different kind of level, right? So that's one of the important things to keep apart, right?
It is, and I want to try. I'm going to use the opportunity to be pedantic and say, there's this sort of reading of levels that you can find across the literatures, where you see, these words, this phrase, written levels of explanation, and you're liable, justifiably so, you're liable to sort of connect this idea that different levels of organization have different explanatory values, right? So an organ has a sort of explanatory contribution to an overall model or an explanation or something like that, that differs in type or in principle from that of a cell, for instance. And that's justifiable, and it's also true. But there is this sort of distinct notion of levels of explanation that came up first in Hempel and Oppenheim in 1948, where they had this idea of levels of theorizing, essentially, or essentially postulating what Wesley Salmon later called the received view in his 4 decades of scientific explanation. So there's a lot of stuff. Like I said, I mean, I think I've mentioned to Yogi, and I'll mention to everyone else here. It takes a good 10 minutes of one-on-one conversation to really kind of zero in on what you're talking about with levels, so that you can have a productive conversation after that. But I guess that's what we're negotiating right now. To go back to Wimsatt's thing, so the local maxima. Um, well, I mean, the local maxima of regularity and predictability just means essentially that at different, temporal, spatiotemporal scales of nature, there's going to be clusterings of types of organizational units that sort of present themselves as objects of study and as, contributing to other forms of scientific work like explanation, description, modeling, etc. And so that's what you're having. So you have these sort of constraints that are put on the way we conceptualize levels following Wimsatt, where the basic domain of the concept is the organization of matter, and it's the organization of matter across different spatiotemporal scales. And then the further claim that these things cluster around different scales.
So it's not the same as it's a scales, but it also has to have this relational aspect where the entities on a given level have to interact in a preferential way, basically, in some way of preferential that we would have to define differently for each level. Yes,
that we would have to define is the key question, because no one agrees on that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not gonna, go deeper into what the phase space of or the alternate modes of organization of matter are right now. But we have a bunch of other questions that are more related to the use of the concept in science right now. But for that, I want to hand over to Kevin Paul, who wants to go first.
Yeah, so thanks a lot also from my side for the introduction and this first sharing of this always difficult thoughts about levels. And I was wondering while I was listening that you mentioned definitions are notoriously unhelpful in this case, maybe specifically because you mentioned it quite frequently now. And I was wondering if there is something more specific to this levels as an issue, that it's more complicated, decisively more complicated to talk about it or to get a clear context about it than for other things. I mean, when you work in complexity or emergence or whatsoever, there's so many things, I would say. And maybe it's because you're a more pedantic or interested philosopher who is just going to the centimeters and millimeters and not stopping there. And that's maybe more the reason than the case itself or the content itself. Can you reflect on that a bit, please?
Sure. I mean, if you stipulate, for instance, what your interest in using the concept is. Let's say I'm interested in explanation, and already you're kind of importing the cues that you get from that literature and the issues that have sort of, applied levels in ways before. Then you can very easily come up with a definition, and that's fine. The issue that I wanted to take on with Bill's comment about definitions is that if you're looking for, a unitary definition for this conception or for this concept, you're certainly going to fail, because there are inconsistent, even contradictory uses that are independently legitimate for different reasons, right? So one interesting thing that comes up very rarely, and I would love to devote another 20 years of my life to this, but I won't, is looking at how the basic idea of levels of organization sort of pans out when you start thinking about like the physical sciences, for instance. I am pretty much limited to the biological sciences because that's more than enough, but there's a lot to talk about there. The other part of your question was, can you repeat the second half of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I would prefer to go even one step further if you're fine.
Okay. No, that's fine.
So because you just mentioned what I was hoping that I have time to ask, and so go into that one as well. So talking maybe a bit about, I'm sorry for that, the level of investigating levels to some degree, and about the ancestors of the level concept itself, and maybe scrolling a bit more in your folders about the history or the nature. So my background is a lot in physical science, because you mentioned it right now. And there, a lot of times it's all going back to this kind of prominent idea of symmetries, so Noether symmetries, and as a backbone of all of physics, as the most fundamental thing we all rely on, and can build other things on. So the relation, still, you mean you need 20 years at least for doing that, and you won't, but still maybe you want to share a bit thoughts about the potentials of levels given to relations to symmetries, for example. And I came to this when I first recognized, I mean, it's of course obvious to you, but that the term level is a palindrome. And I think
Yeah,
that's more sweet.
that adds a aesthetic aspect to the
Exactly.
concept. Huh,
Yeah.
interesting. Um, okay, and I remember what the other part of your question was, so I'll try and answer both very quickly.
Okay.
So
Perfect.
for my 2 cents, and this is only sort of half baked, a half baked report on thinking about levels in the physical sciences. Um, One thing that you typically, but not exclusively, sort of trade off when you go from biology to physics is you trade the notion of organization for the notion of order.
Right.
And in order, you can very easily talk about, symmetry and stuff like that. With organization, on the other hand, um, there is very little. There's symmetry to be found, of course, depending on what kind of formalism that you're working with. If you want to mathematize these things and stuff like that, but in sort of like living systems, anti-symmetry or broken symmetry is much more often the case, and I would say that has to do with the nature of organization itself having to do to maintain itself in the face of perturbations and stuff like that. So that's a kind of half baked sort of half answer. The other
Just
question
to
that you
jump in here, you wouldn't say there, or you would say there are no broken levels, cannot be in an organization.
what do you mean broken levels?
I'm not sure, but just because you said about broken symmetries, because they're relying on sort of an order, and we are relying on a sort of an organization with levels,
Right.
we cannot have broken levels, maybe, or not.
The concept very well could be broken. That doesn't mean it's useless.
Yeah, yeah,
Broken in a sense that it's
yeah.
just this fragmentary notion. No, what I mean by broken symmetry is just very basically thinking like if you start with like a fertilized egg, then once it starts dividing, then already the daughter cells are going to be different than the progenitor cells. For instance, that's an instance of broken symmetry, and that has very much to do with the organization of these things.
Hmm.
So, like for instance, the accessibility of the chromatin, for instance, and stuff like that, which
Yeah,
is physical, but it manifests itself in what we would usually qualify in terms of organization. The other question you asked was, is this concept any different from something like complexity or other sort of heavy concepts that people have spent decades and generations working on? I would say a qualified yes, um, acknowledging on the one hand that any concept can be put under the microscope, and once we do that, there's going to be an absolute fracturing of consensus insofar as people are interested in really getting at these nitty gritty issues and stuff like that. Acknowledging that, but that's not really an interesting way to put the notion. I think that levels of organization maintains a kind of dual presence where there is this sort of abstract quality to it that we intuitively grasp and we apply and stuff like that when we say like this level is distinct from this level, it's qualitatively different from this level. The things that we use to investigate this level are just once again qualitatively different from this level. Whereas on the other side, if you look at what the concept refers to in biological context, these things are the most if any, some of the most well characterized entities that we have in nature. Like if you think about the plethora of cells and stuff like that, like not all cells are equally well characterized in biology, So there already is an interesting distinction when you go from like the notion of a cell to like a very specific cell, like T cells in the fly brain or something like that. Something very, very specific. Nonetheless, these things are all equally concrete in their sort of material status. They can be characterized. They're not given to the sort of theoretical or philosophical fights that you would have if you cash out the discussion of the concept in different terms.
Can I quickly ask an addition to this? So the thing I was just thinking, are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells at the same level? Because the organelles of the eukaryotes are at the same level of organization as a prokaryotic progenitor. So that's just as a specific example. That leads me to the second part of the more general question here. How, in such a situation, the levels are relative, right? So and how do you make a cutoff between this is a level and this is not a level, or this is maybe a major level and this is are there major levels and minor levels?
Well, I don't have the authority to say where levels begin and stop. That's the whole point, is that I think concepts are communally used. And so it's interesting to look at the trends of usage within a community to sort of come up with answers to these. From my 2 cents, if those 2 cents are worth anything, I would say that prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells are at the same level, but they occupy different scale ranges.
So I wasn't, I first wanted to ask, is a bacterium and a sequoia tree at the same level? But that's exactly the point that you made at the very beginning. It's not scale, that's clear. But here you have organizations within the eukaryotic cells, the chloroplasts in plants and the mitochondria in all of them, that are equivalent, homologous to free living bacteria in the past. So that's why I was choosing this example.
Well, this is an interesting sort of issue that comes up, is that even within the sort of what I call canonical levels, those canonical levels are the levels that you see in every biological textbook. The sort of universal entities that that biology students are basically taught, like cells, tissues, organs, organisms, ecosystems, populations, stuff like that. What's interesting is that each one of these notions, population, ecosystem, organism, have very rich histories to them, around which there is monumental variation, just like there is with levels. So let's take, for instance, the notion of an organism, notoriously fractured concept, notoriously fragmentary, where we have to sort of group things together that range from, the smallest bacteria to like, blue whales that are, the size of small ecosystems, so there's going to be major overlaps and, stuff like that. This is, I think, to go back to the original question of local maxima, the notion or this characterization of local maxima, this is where I would cash out Wimsatt's sort of insight about the size of the notion. Because what you see is, you have a range of units or a range of entities or processes that we group together. They're not going to fit together in any simple way. Organisms, let's say, even cells, is anything but unitary. But what we do have is this sort of local maxima across which there's going to be sort of attributions of, of being a unit of some type, right? And we're able to usually negotiate this kind of conceptual terrain pretty easily when we contextualize these things with our interests and stuff like that. Not in a lazy way to just say that it's interest relative and stuff like that, but when I'm speaking to molecular neuroscience, cellular and molecular neuroscientists, for instance, then, and I read their work and I ask them something about, what do you mean by the cellular level here? And they say, oh, yeah, right. So you look at this specific protein in this specific type of cell in this specific area of the brain, there are these sort of like background cues that, prevent them from being confused from someone talking about like liver cells or something like that, a different part of the body. And yet there is this sort of basic communication that is enabled by talking to levels. So there's a constant jumping in not only, how you understand a particular level in this specific context or even an instance of usage. There's not only the sort of different conceptions that people have within these different instances and contexts. There is also this diversity of, for instance, granularity. So this is one thing that I've gotten into in my in the significance folder, or no, I'm sorry, the character folder of working on levels, is that when you're working in a certain type of context, let's say a pedagogical context, you want to teach biology, you want to teach a field or something like that, versus being in the lab and having to convey your findings in a review paper or a research article. These people are going to use the same concept, but in radically different ways. And one of the ways that it's so radically different is in the granularity that they sort of articulate what they want this concept to be doing, right? So in a textbook, it's very wide open. Like they'll openly talk about the cellular level, for instance, and that's not inherently meaningless. It has uses, right? But that's going to be a very, very different kind of game when you're talking to research biologists in the lab who are trying to convey their findings by using this concept.
So if I may kind of broaden the aperture again a bit. So I found this very interesting when you said that at the physical levels, we talk about order and then we move on in the biological realm to talk about organization, but we could kind of move on even further and look at social phenomena or complex societal phenomena. And I don't know what word we would use, but I think from an intuitive notion, the clarity of the level or the ease with which a textbook would, for example, talk about social stratifications and so on and so forth, decreases. So it would be much harder for us to kind of clearly say, okay, this belongs to the social level, than it would be for us to say this belongs to the atomic level intuitively. There's an increase in some sense in at the complexity of defining the level. Intuitive feeling I have. So I think there are two directions that I would be interested in or would be interested in hearing you. So the first one is, in some sense, is kind of the dynamics beneath the stabilization and the formation of levels. Should we think about that like people like Peirce did, who said, okay, we have habits that form and they form at the atomic level, and then they're kind of very, very stable and very clear patterns or very clear habits that manifest atomic or subatomic levels, and that these levels become less and less clear or have less and less clear boundaries as we move on towards biology and move on towards kind of the social sciences. And then the second direction would be, in more general terms, how should we think about the emergence or the stabilization of levels and the interrelationship between higher and lower levels? So one of the examples that may not kind of directly fall into or depending on how you classify levels, but an interesting ecological example is that I recently learned is at the end of the last ice age, basically. So if you look at body weight densities throughout an ecosystem, you will find levelized structures, and you will find that they lump together, and you have kind of the mouse. I'll just call it like that, the mouse little level. Then you have like the I don't know, you have the bird and then like the goose and duck level, and then you have the wolf and whatever level. But for example, one of the interesting things that happened at the end of the last ice age is, for example, all the megafauna, so everything above 1,000 kilograms, died out. And basically, from the evidence that the paleontologists gathered, the lower levels kind of stayed completely stable in some sense. So higher levels could kind of be disturbed while leaving lower levels intact. So is there an underlying dynamic that lower levels cannot be disturbed versus higher levels can be, while leaving the lower levels intact? So yeah, so kind of those are the two questions. First, kind of this difference in, or this question of how do the levels stabilize, and then the interrelationship between the different levels.
Okay, so that's a really interesting set of questions. There's a couple of things I'd like to say. I think one of the sort of missing one of the things that didn't come up that might be missing here is if we're talking about overall trends across putative levels, we want to talk about at the smallest scales where atoms start forming up into entire species sort of occupy very wide geographic regions and stuff like that. One of the things that is kind of missing is complexity. And the trend, the purported trend here has been that over time, evolution has increased, or living organisms have increased in their complexity. It's not unilaterally true. In fact, what you said might be, well, I don't know if density or weight is enough to say that there is a trend away from complexity, but there is a
Actually,
sorry, go ahead.
just because you asked, the overall complexity, so the overall number of different living organisms has steadily increased even after mass extinction. So we kind of are still currently pretty much at the peak of number of different organisms living together. So the overall complexity has increased, even though kind of megafauna has died out.
Okay, and there have, just to be clear, there have been, very compelling cases of reduction of complexity.
Right, but kind of short term. Like I don't know the exact data, and I think it's very hard to get it now because of the last 50 and 100 years. But before that, we basically had peak complexity in terms of biodiversity and difference of adaptation and differentiation in organisms.
Okay. Yes, my point for bringing up complexity here is that the more complex a system, the more easily it is, the more easily done it is, more easily done to disturb that system. And so for that reason, and this is just intuitively, because I want to actually get to the other issue you said, there does seem to be a sort of stability that we find at lower scales than we find at higher scales. But I would say that might even be just an anthropomorphic bias, because change is ubiquitous, I would say, across the scales of nature. As we get to sort of atoms and like non-biological, physical entities and stuff like that, I would report feeling that there seems to be more stability and lack of opportunity to sort of disrupt the order, organization, and stuff like that. But this kind of feeds also into the other issue that you said. You mentioned that the social level, for instance. I don't think that social or being social is lends itself well to level language because it is more of like its own domain. And so one of the interesting things about applying the levels concept to, for instance, human society or humans in general, or social animals and stuff like that, is not that we form these hierarchies amongst ourselves. That's not even close to the levels concept, in my opinion. But what we do see are patterns of organization that are extremely robust, but at the same time very easily disturbed, where just think about what a team of people can accomplish when they're working in a coordinated fashion and have years of experience with each other versus an individual working in their basement, right? It's not going to be unilaterally the case that one is always better than the other, but in general, there are these trends of organization and stuff like that in social systems that is present. However, I do think that once we get into the social realm, the things that made the levels concept such an attractive notion for talking about sort of sub-organismal matter, loses its significance because other things are simply at work in the social realm, right? So what is the level of a belief? I don't think that's a well-posed question or a well-posed notion. But the fact of the matter is that, there are beliefs that influence our behavior, stuff like that. So we trade off what we were getting from the levels concept in one instance for something else in the other, as we ascend sort of, scales of nature and human activity.
Just as a quick follow-up, the mental realm is the same, right? That's your favorite, not a level, I think.
Well, no, I would say no. That's exactly right. I wouldn't call it the mental level at all. But I mean, this is pure editorial at this point. I'm not going to defend this, but this is being recording, so maybe I'll get an email from someone by saying this. But I don't think of there being a mental level in any kind of meaningful sense, at least when we're talking about levels of organization, because it so clearly occupies like a range of different levels, right? Um, so if we talk about social cognition, right? If we would attribute, and I don't even know if people would do this, I'm sure they would attribute a belief to a group, for instance, versus a belief in an individual, versus a component of a belief or something like that. These are going to correspond to many different levels of organization. But the key point with denying that there is a sort of mental level of organization is that when you go beyond whatever unit you choose to say, manifests a belief or some kind of mental state or something like that. It could be an individual, could be part of an individual, could be an individual within their environment, embodied, inactive, et cetera. When you go beyond any of these things, there's going to be a unit of organized matter that sort of fills the gap, such that we don't have to refer to any kind of mental realm. And so that's kind of interesting, right? So if we move from a human individual to some kind of aggregated unit, let's say like a family or like a circle of friends or something like that, moving on even beyond that to like even a society or a nation or something like that, we don't need to skip anything with some kind of mysterious non-material sort of layer. And I'm not saying that mental language is not, does not lend itself to leveled language. It does, but it cannot, in my opinion, it should not be conflated with this sort of organizational variety of levels that's so important in the um, biological literature. If I can follow up on that, I have actually a pretty big point. No, I'll follow up later if it's appropriate. I think Paul wanted to say something.
I mean, it's a quick follow-up basically to the direction that Yogi has gone that I wanted to go, is basically because for me at least there seem to be multiple hierarchies or multiple levels in some sense, because if we for example look at kind of early like the emergentists, for example, or like even going back to I think Neoplatonists and people, they had like super levels in some sense where they were talking about matter and then life and mind. And I think it's first of all very interesting to observe that, for example, in biology and physics, levels are very commonly used and are very, I would say, stable practices, both kind of ontologically somewhat accepted and epistemologically used. But what do you think about this notion of having kind of, we have I don't have the right super levels, but let's say we have like matter as a base level, and then or as one level, and set in there we have atoms and molecules and subatomic particles, and then we have life, and we get certain levels stratified in there. Is that something you work with, or is your focus on biology partly to, in some sense, avoid that question of how, because so kind of, okay, I'll not put it this way. Where I wanted to go is, the problem with levels is, if you say there are levels of organizations, then it seems like, yes, the universe is stratified if we take an ontological notion, but these levels are just like, once we depict them or once we see them in Wimsatt's beautiful depiction that I encourage everyone to look up online, you'll easily find it. They're kind of similar, and they're qualitative, and so also our work has been very central about showing how those levels differ qualitatively in a way that is not depicted once they are depicted as levels. So you know where I'm going, but I'm just curious on your reflections basically on this type of problem.
So this is really interesting, and it comes back down to a sort of like getting to know you qualifications about, what are we even talking about. That doesn't make it uninteresting, but it does sort of because it poses more questions. So instead of taking a position on that stuff, so the elephant in the room, that as I see it, is the great chain of being, for instance, is something that people are trying to bring into sort of association with this idea of levels of organization. And the short answer to that is no, they're not related. But that's way too quick, and it's also wrong because they're not completely distinct either. So it's very difficult to get at that. Nonetheless, I would try to flush this out and into a set of interesting questions that we can follow up on instead of taking a position. And the question is, and this is a really tough question, especially regarding how much sort of weight we want to give to the ontology of levels, whether or not they actually exist, whether or not that makes a difference, with all of these other conceptual questions. And that is, independently of our discussion up until now, humans just tend to categorize things. right? Just I would probably call that a psychological fact, if that's okay terminology, that we like to categorize things. And levels language in general lends itself to sort of partitioning any kind of quality in any kind of way, so that we can sort of if we provide criteria for making that sort of intelligible and consistent and blah blah blah, then this is just a kind of universal behavior, almost universal behavior that I would see. I don't have any evidence for this, but I would wager possibly even across cultures. The way that we just partition things, especially nature and stuff like that, which poses the question: is the levels concept, as I mean it, and as we kind of have floating in the air at the moment, anything more than just a way of categorizing the things of nature? That's a really tough question. And it doesn't matter what my position is on that, because other people are going to have different positions as well, right? For my 2 cents, I think that there is something more to this concept that distinguishes it from other sort of levels language. But that is, that's easily said. It's much more difficult to show that that is the case.
But to kind of move in that direction, mustn't we put on our kind of pragmatic realist head in some sense and ask, what are the dynamics that stabilize the levels themselves, or what makes the aggregations in the phase space of the universe actually be aggregations of the phase space of the universe? So doesn't that kind of this extremely tricky insight directly require us to basically ask the question, so what could be the dynamics that stabilize a level and produce the stability that a level has? Because that then in turn allows us to say, okay, yes, these are categories that we use, and they're mental, but there's a pragmatic there's a pragmatic relation that we build up with them because they have some stability in the world and because they themselves have a dynamic that self-stabilizes them.
Yes, exactly right. And let me, I guess I'll qualify everything I said with my own position a little bit. And what comes back to the table at this juncture is the sort of heuristic notion, or the heuristic character of levels. The way that it's used is to, get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. And whenever you invoke the levels concept in any kind of instance, right? I mean, there's going to be once we're clear on what we're actually referring to with the concept, how we understand it, et cetera. Once those are settled, there is, as a matter of fact, going to be different sort of historical trajectories leading to what sort of justifies you applying the levels concept in that way. Right. So take, for instance, when I was talking about the differences in granularity, if I come at you and I say, well, the cellular level is one of the most well-confirmed sort of, domains in the natural world, in biological realms and stuff like that, no one would disagree with that. But on the other hand, what work does that do? It doesn't do very much, right? But what it does sort of indicate is that when it comes to sort of general statements about cells, let's say, and it could be another level as well, some of these levels are going to be far more sort of well established than others. What gets really interesting is when you look at like particular domains of science and you look at like new levels. When people say that, we know about this level, we know about that level, but there's one in between that's really interesting, then you can start looking at, what is justifying them, because they don't have that trajectory of history that a lot of other these canonical levels do. So especially to complement, the notion of canonical levels, there's also non-canonical levels. In fact, someone who's here, Alejandra, and I are working on the recent history, the last maybe 30 years or so, of microcircuits in neuroscience as a putatively new level that's perched between the sort of tissue level and the cell level. And so the answer, I think that gives a bit more of an answer. Let me wrap that up with the heuristic stuff, is that there's going to be a sort of iterative process of doing our best to confirm, but also, fall flat when it comes to the things that we posit using the levels concept. Just because we've been successful in the past is no guarantee that it's going to be useful in the future. In fact, the concept has severe limitations. So, I mean, that's to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I think in particular when you look at neuroscience and you have the regions, for example, of interest, that would be also exciting to have this microcircuitry, mimicry, or isomorphism to sort of level. But you mentioned the heuristics before. I think your repository was in the significance folder. And as a best attempt, and as you laid it out right now, I was wondering how you think about perspectivism then, or is there some sort of fusion with your pragmatism approach and perspectivism?
Um, I'm broadly in support. I mean, this is just, I don't have much to say about perspectivalism. I think it's perfectly fine. I think it's much more nuanced than just sort of invoking pluralism, for instance. Invoking pluralism um, with many exceptions, nonetheless, far too often sort of bottoms out in some kind of relativism, like where everything's great. There are many different ways to do things. End of discussion. This is the end of the paper, and that's unfortunate. The perspectivalism that's been developed by people like Geary and Massimi and Wimsatt, even these are great. These are great sort of developments that build on the basic insight of pluralism, which I think is well founded. Um, uh, so I would say I'm broadly in support of it, but not much more to say about perspectivalism.
All right. I think at this point, we want to open up the discussion to the whole public. Before I do that, I still have one sort of question that we skirted around a lot, I think already, but just to clarify, maybe summarize what we've discussed. If I read Wimsatt, and if I understand you correctly, Dan, as well, levels are sort of a prerequisite for a limited intelligence like us to understand the world it lives in. Is that a statement you would subscribe to? Or, and
Well,
also, following up on that, just before you answer that, are levels, is that are they real in the sense they're an ontological issue, or are they an epistemological issue, or are they two aspects, an epistemological and an ontological, of the same thing?
okay, well, I mean, how much time do we got? I want to try and get some other questions. So
It was supposed to be
okay,
a quick summary. Yes.
okay. Well, I mean, my position on any of these things, doesn't really carry that much weight unless you're just personally interested. Um, the Are they required so that we can make sense of things? I think is comes in direct conflict and collides with the thing that I said before regarding the question of is the levels concept, just basically an anti-realist, conception of or way of categorizing nature, right? That might gather a couple of crude, generalities here and there, but is mostly just our way of imposing order on the universe. Um, I mean, do you really know what I think? Because I mean, I don't think it really matters. I do think that well, I mean, I don't want to cop out. I want to say that I mean there are in many instances there are compelling reasons and evidence to say that the way levels are used, even within entire traditions, is merely an instrument. And I use a lot of scare quotes around merely because I said, don't denigrate heuristics. Why would I denigrate instrumental? But if you're a realist and you're trying to or if you're trying to recover realistic sort of closure from the levels concept, then calling it merely instrumental, is something that might come at you. There's good arguments for both sides, and I don't really feel it's productive to go into the realism, anti-realism stuff unless there's a concrete issue involved.
It's totally okay to sit on the fence. I just wanted to sum up the discussion that we have
Okay.
had before in that sense. And now I would like to ask the members of the audience if they had questions. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand. Great. We have Andrea first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Dan. Great discussion, and I'm gonna just shift a little bit the focus, but not too much because the reference is always that essay that also Yogi was mentioning, the one on the ontology of complex systems that I recently read several times. I kind of work with it and grapple with it, but always with some difficulties because Wimsatt prose is not very accessible always in a way. And you said something about perspectives now, and a concept in that essay that I found incredibly fascinating, but also incredibly hard to understand is the concept of causal thickets. So that's not necessarily the strict topic of the session, but if I don't pick your brain on this, I have no idea whom I should ask actually. So I think I don't know. If someone has thoughts about that, that'd probably be you, I guess.
Okay.
Can we, Dan, quickly explain what that is?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. So to the context of the question is it's internal to Wimsatt's work. And Wimsatt's ontology is sort of separated into three different sort of ideas. One of them is levels of organization, the second is perspectives, and the third is causal thickets. Now, I kind of depart a little bit from Bill, but I've been talking with him about this. The basic idea behind these ideas is levels of organization is, as we've been talking about, that this floating notion in the room where we talk about, stratification of nature, et cetera. Perspectives, as I understand him, are not meant to be subjective, but they're the things that a perspective sort of highlights and posits as part of, the realm of access that an agent or community of agents have in talking about a complex phenomenon. And that's kind of a weird roundabout, characterization of the idea. But in his complexity and organization paper, for instance, he has this really great picture of like what happens when we partition a piece of granite and when we partition a Drosophila or a living organism and stuff like that into different perspectives, not into levels, but into different perspectives. So with the with the rock, we can have like a thermodynamic perspective. We can have like a what's it called? I can't. I'm so terrible with physics. We have different perspectives in physics. And in biology, we can have like a cybernetic perspective. That's kind of a nod to the 70s. That's pretty cool. That is still in circulation. Morphological perspective, et cetera. The point being is that between these different perspectives, the things that we sort of highlight as constituent of the system in a complex system are going to be different. And in the simple system, that is the rock, the partitionings are going to coincide with the things that it sort of physically separates within the system. The point being is that perspectives are required when levels cannot give us the regularities that we're looking for. Now, causal thickets takes it a step further, and it says that things are so radically sort of, observer dependent, the things that are constituent of the system, that all regularities break down unless you're within, a tradition that is able to talk with each other. Now, my comment on this is, and the way that I'm not sure that I'm deviating from Wimsatt. I'm still talking with him about this, but when we talk about perspectives or when Wimsatt talks about perspectives and thickets, what he usually talks about is abandoning the concept before, or the idea before that, in favor of the new one. So he says when levels break down or when perspectives break down, then we have to move on to the other ideas. One of the questions that I have asked him, and I've not received an answer yet, is to what degree levels really are not present or absent, or the way that they really break down as forms of order or organization in nature. So for instance, a perfect idea of, or a perfect example of a causal thicket for Wimsatt is the social realm. Right there, it's not really useful at all to divvy things up into levels because there's so much going on in the social realm, right? I mean, but what I would say is that, okay, that's true. I would also not want to sort of pack everything from the social realm into levels, but at the same time, that doesn't take away from the fact that we are also, and nonetheless, still, organized units of matter. So it's not about abandoning one in favor of the other. It's just abandoning the usefulness of it in favor of the other. So that's what I would say.
That's a really complex topic, and I think that's the whole point. The world isn't a simple place, so we need accordingly complex and flexible concepts to deal with it. Moritz, next question.
Hey, thank you so much for the interesting discussion so far. You mentioned it quickly at the beginning. I was kind of interested. You mentioned Mars levels of analysis, or usually now they're understood as levels of explanation. And I was working with some neuroscientists on a paper on levels of creativity, like models of creativity, and what different levels there are. Usually, like different models have different explanatory goals. You have like models that try to understand the role of creativity on a societal level. They understand it on a neurobiological level or somewhere in between in cognitive neuroscience. And so I was wondering, how would you differentiate like the levels of analysis versus the levels of organization? Is that something about like epistemological, ontological differences? And like the little extra question I had there, where is the space for like what Marr calls the computational level or like the informational level in the levels of organization, like we talked about it now, because that seems to be something that is like us trying to put behavior of biological systems in little neat boxes, but information itself is probably not something that is in the organisms or in the ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a fantastic sort of question because it's a tiny little thread, but it pulls with it a very, very large carpet. And I'll try to tread softly here because there's a lot of there are a lot of egos in the room when you start talking about this stuff. But I mean, in a more constructive sort of approach to this, what's interesting about the way that I would sort of differentiate between these levels, these notions of levels. This is actually the topic of a paper that is being absolutely savaged in the journals at the moment, just totally savaged. Where I try to make the case that levels of analysis a la Marr, levels of explanation, levels of organization are distinct ideas, and the basis that I try and draw these distinctions from is to say that they have different intellectual traditions attached to them. I mean, that's not the only difference, but they have vastly different intellectual traditions attached to them. So, for instance, Marr was, for instance, I think very clearly getting at a different set of issues in talking about cognition being leveled in the way that he talks about with his computational, algorithmic, and implementational, then was the case, and I would say has ever been the case in the tradition of levels of organization. Levels of explanation is a third one. How do they fit together? They fit together in two ways. One is very messy and unsatisfying, but is far closer to a grander view of things. The other one is actually it's the same thing, just from the different angle. So, for instance, one of the points that I make in this paper that's being savaged is that we conflate these notions at our own peril, because levels of analysis via Marr does not track levels of organization per se. They are not interchangeable. So, for instance, putative levels of organization, which Marr is perfectly open, or would have been perfectly open to referring to, are all found in implementation, right? That's where all levels of organization are found. Around and about those levels, you can also postulate computational explanations, computational modeling, algorithmic stuff, whatever you want, but they are very distinct notions for that reason, because the implementation that you're interested in can be one level, it could be two levels, it could be any number of levels, right? The realization relation, which is really the thing that's doing all the work there metaphysically, I would say, in the Marrian sort of tradition, is not really a comfortable bedfellow with the notion of levels of organization, I think. I mean, it can be made consistent with it, right? So let's say that we want to, we're interested in the relation between an organ functionally described, functional in the sense of Marr, and the realizing set of cells that compose, right, this organ. There's nothing that I can say or anyone can say, and there's no reason to deny the ability to say that we can describe an organ functionally, computationally, or abstractly, or whatever, and then relate that via some appropriate relation to a realizing basis that is at a lower so-called level. but already look at, what, how much strain we're putting on this, language of levels in the first place, in the sense that you're perfectly open to doing that, but they're not going to track between the traditions. They're very distinct in that regard. So they're uncomfortable bedfellows. One point that I do want to sort of put out there, that is part of this paper I've been mentioning, is that a source of conflation, and a very interesting source of conflation, that I would love people to pay attention to, but it's just sort of, used as a source of leveraging against making finer grained distinctions, is that we can have philosophical issues that are very unitary in their sort of literatures. One of the good examples of that is reduction and reductionism, for instance. And these can track very, very differently the ways that we cash out our levels language, but they are used completely openly with each other, in the sense that if we say something like, does the computational level reduce to the implementational level, or vice versa, already the presence of the levels language sort of gives this tendency to conflate, the issues that I was just talking about, because, the same sort of wording of these problems is found in, physical biology, where we're talking about, do organ level explanations reduce to cellular level explanations, right? So the nuts and bolts of these questions, does it reduce from here to here, et cetera, is unitary, or appears to be unitary. But we are in fact asking very different questions when it comes to these different notions of level. But these distinctions between the level traditions is not heeded to. I think I went over time, and I kind of drifted.
No.
Okay?
No.
What's the name of the paper? Just that I can have a look.
No, it's not out yet. It's still under review.
So
I'm looking forward to it.
I mean, on a similar note, but in a different direction, levels of abstraction is another often used terms, right? A term which is completely something else again, is it not?
Well, yes, it is. And I mean, so I have this little, what do you call it? Bar trick, to use another metaphor, where, if we're having drinks and we're, discussing about levels and stuff like that, we're trying to find each other, et cetera. And people are like, what about, this and this and this. One of the sort of questions that I throw back at the person asking about, levels of X, whatever that X might be, is, do you really need the notion of levels? Do you really need that term? Is it just convenient to use that term, or can you replace it with something like degrees or amount of, or something like that? So when you talk about levels of abstraction, in what circumstances, and I'm not denying that there are none, I'm not denying that there are. In what circumstances is it more constructive to talk about levels of abstraction than talk about degrees of abstraction?
Yeah, you actually traumatized me that way, I have to say, because I always, when I use the word level, I think of you, which is probably a nice thing, but only use the word levels when really necessary. I have two more questions. We're nearing the end of the discussion, but I want to give priority to people from the audience. Or
exactly.
Yes, Dan, do you want to? Yes.
I just wanted to ask if there were more questions from the audience, because we've been dominating.
No, but if nobody is asking any questions, Dan, I have more. So to finish up, I have two very simple questions, Dan. So the first is, levels are emerging, I guess, during the history of the universe. Is the universe, has it emerged all the levels there are, or are there going to be more levels emerging?
Well, I mean, this is like, come on. I mean, I'm glad we didn't talk about emergence today. I'm not interested in, that in particularly.
How do levels come about then, Dan? How do they become a thing?
Well, in biology, usually through development or evolution.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Simple answer, simple question.
So they emerge through development or evolution?
You can also say appear.
Okay, yeah.
No, I mean, clearly, I mean, no, if anyone claims to have a Gonzai perspective on the state of the universe and whether or not it's final or not, they're lying. But I mean, once again, for my 2 cents, because who cares what I think? For my 2 cents, I don't think that all the levels of organization have been exhausted in terms of, but we'd have to nail down what we mean by possible, or conceivable, levels and stuff like that. But
yeah, I mean, is this an ongoing process? Are the levels evolving? Basically, we could also ask the question this way, right?
Well, in biology, and this is where I'm really glad that I'm talking about biology and not in physics and not physics too. The answer to that question is intertwined with the state of and fate of evolution. So if you're going to ask, have we seen all the levels that we're going to see? I would say no already. But I mean, if you want an interesting answer to that, we have to think about, what are the possible forms of that evolution can produce, and do these fit some kind of putative conception of levels that we would be we'd be happy to agree upon, at least at least for tentatively.
Thanks. I mean, I have my own. I more or less agree with that kind of view. Also, with the limitations of what we can say. And then I have one last question: do the commitment to levels make you an anti-reductionist?
Oh man, that's an interesting question. So I don't want to nitpick the debate and stuff like that. I'll actually kind of take a position here, because I'm of split thoughts. I have split thoughts on this. I mean, one of the ways that the levels concept was applied in biology early on in the 1920s and 30s was as a palliative to what was understood under the notion of mechanism back then, because it seemed to be far too austere in talking about what was in nature and stuff like that. So one of the earliest uses of this, I talked about this in the dissertation already, my dissertation, was to sort of populate the world with other things. And so in some form, right, there is this sort of inherent anti-reductionist sort of feeling to levels, but that is nowhere close to exhausting the space of answers. Because are we talking about ontological reductionism? Are we talking about methodological, epistemological, some variation thereof, et cetera? And just to get on my soapbox for a couple of seconds, I would probably label myself. I mean, we actually talked about this, the different isms that you have to be aware of, because if you identify with a particular ism, that is usually something that you don't question anymore. It's something that you usually take on as a commitment, as you said. And one of those isms, and that I'll use as a soapbox, is I'm kind of an old style materialist. Like, I think until we have truly exhausted, what we can do with matter and energy, I really need to be convinced of what its usefulness is going to be. But I mean, I try not to let that tread into topics of all topics. Long story short, I mean, I just kind of played one of my ism cards right here, that I'm an old style materialist. So in that sense, I mean, if people are going to say that levels sort of, by using the notion of levels, we're postulating some kind of non-material plane of existence, for instance, and there are many people like that. I would say no. In that sense, I am a reductionist, because, in fact, I'm an eliminative, of an eliminative attitude, so to speak. So in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Once
but
again,
there you confuse me a little bit, because eliminative reductionism. Okay, so you're saying there is no, for example, we talked about the mental realm not really being a level, but just a sort of a different way of describing things, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
So if you say there are levels, so Wimsatt has this famous quote in his book where he says, if your philosophy can account for a quark more than for your spouse, then there's a problem with your philosophical framework, right? Not with the world. Because, the people around you, they're entities at their own level, which is already problematic, because us as multicellular beings, we span many levels, of course. So, but the point is that how can you, so you can be an eliminative reductionist in the sense that you don't believe in dualism or some silly philosophy about mental phenomena, but you cannot be a eliminative reductionist in the sense of not believing in the existence of those levels in a way that is either essential to our description or actually real, right?
Well, I mean, you can. And in fact, some people are.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if I want to name names. I mean this in very much in support. There's a very famous and awesome philosopher of neuroscience who famously has this ruthless reductionism. Fantastic work. I disagree almost completely, but at the same time, I think he's onto something. In some of this earlier ruthless reductionism work, it's John Bickel. He's great. He says in his earlier work, for instance, he said that it is only at the cellular molecular level, and that's already kind of two levels, but we'll give it to him. It's only at the cellular molecular level that we find genuine mechanistic causes. Everything else is just, as he would put it, merely heuristic. It's useful for us to describe, but they're not genuinely causal, for instance. That would be a denial of the existence of higher levels of organization, for instance. I would disagree with it, but at the same time, I mean, like I said, the spirit in which I would like to cast these kinds of questions is in terms of the size of the concept, which extrapolates very well, I think, to the size of the project that we're all in some way a part of. We're not going to be part of this project of inquiry and following our curiosity in the same way. Rather, we're going to be following up on our idiosyncratic and also institutionally given sort of interests and stuff like that, the way these things change over time. Anything that sort of expands the horizons to allow as many of these sort of approaches and individuals to sort of find time to conduct themselves in a way that we would somehow be able to charitably call each other scientific or naturalistic or philosophical or whatever you want to call it, should be preserved. So, I mean, when you said reductionism, I understand eliminative attached to an ism as an eliminative materialism. And, my 2 cents on that is I can't call myself an eliminative materialist because I think it's an inherently unstable position. It purports to deny the existence of something, but doesn't really postulate something in terms of being an eliminative materialist. Rather, I would modify it a little bit. Maybe it's just a word game where I would say that I'm just a materialist, and about some things I have to be eliminative.
Yeah, fair enough. I like Wimsatt's take on this, where he says, reductionism is a absolutely necessary methodology in science. If you don't use the analytical method, you can just go hug a tree. He doesn't say that, I say that. But if you are taking this, greedy reductionism as a worldview, then you lose all the richness of the rainforest ontology, the multi-leveled world, right? I mean, that's an interesting sort of take. So it's clear that you're not saying that phenomena at the higher levels, they exist and they have causal influences on each other, because levels are peaks of causal regularity as well, as far as I understand.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So eliminativist in the sense there's no magic beyond what's going on. The universe is sort of one in some way. Materialism is also a difficult word because does it include physical fields and things like that? I mean, we can
right,
discuss till the cows come home, and it's not a very.
And trying to decide if we're physicalists or materialists. I'm not interested.
Yep, and the realm of physics has changed constantly over human history, and it's also a difficult topic. Dan and I are involved in a sort of hopefully still ongoing discussion about what naturalism is and how we should actually define it these days, which is also an interesting aspect of this. But I think we're out of time. And unless there are urgent questions from the audience or from the panel still, I would like to thank Dan very much for extremely clear and comprehensive. I mean, what you covered so much ground in these 1.5 hours. It's just amazing. I feel exhausted, but in a good way. And we're going to record this and put it online. And I think that's really worthwhile. And thanks for this really, really good and concise and very clear wrap up of a very interesting and complicated topic. Thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone.
Thank you all for coming around. I don't take this for granted. I'm very happy that you could be here and would listen to me.